Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. So welcome back, Bobbi. We're going to go back to 1787, I think close to fall of that year. But before we do that, we've got the Fast Five.
The Fast Five.
And it's my turn today to ask you questions.
May I just add in here why I sighed so big?
Yeah.
You know I'm really devoted to this because I'm missing an Indiana Fever game right now.
Wow. Okay.
I'm recording it, but I don't want to see the score.
Okay. Yeah, don't look at your phone. All right, so we're ready for question number one. What's your favorite funny story to tell people?
There are so many of them, but one that comes to mind often is my first year teaching at Lincoln. I had my 6th grade accelerated class, and I was pregnant, and I was close to the end of the pregnancy, I would say, and the chair that I had at my teacher desk had wheels that it was a rolling chair, and one wheel would often come off. So I'm sitting down and my obedient little 6th graders, they're sitting there. The wheel came off of my chair and I ended up on my rear end on the floor.
Oh, no.
And they didn't know what to do. And, you know, you could hear the kind of collective gasp. I started laughing.
Of course.
And they're like, do we laugh or do we help her? Or it was just, they're just so innocent. And it was just like, finally a couple of them came up, you know, and are you okay? But just the, you know, the looks. I thought it was funny. They were having trouble knowing how to feel.
Right. It's sweet.
I'm like, I don't think I'm scary, but.
No, you're not. I had you that year.
They were little innocent 6th graders.
Number two, what's your biggest pet peeve?
There are so many. Where do I start? I chose two. One,
Okay.
I don't want to hear. If you have gum in your mouth, I don't want to hear it.
That's so teachery of you.
Don't crack it. Don't, you know, just,
Okay,
And
noted.
that goes back to my high school years. That pet peeve.
Okay.
And the other one is probably also just as big as people driving in the fast lane on a 4-lane highway and
Going
won't
50.
Won't get out of the way so you can go around them because you want to go fast.
Yeah. You don't road rage, do you? Next question.
To myself.
What's something surprising you've learned about yourself?
I would say, you know, I knew I was an introvert, but just how much that affects in my everyday life. The fact that I am an introvert, how it changes certain dynamics.
Yeah, I can see that. And I'm an extrovert, but sometimes I feel very much like an introvert. Depends on the situation, right?
Right. Well, and I've had, like, even my doctor said, how can you be an introvert? You were a teacher. Well, but that's, you know.
When you
that's
step
a
onto
different-
the stage, it's different.
Right.
That's the same as is for me in radio. It's like when I am behind the microphone, I have a different courage.
Right.
What's your favorite quote?
I have a lot of those as well, but one of my favorites, and I think it's really relevant right now, is from September 1859 from Abraham Lincoln. So he wasn't president yet. He said, the people are the rightful masters of both Congresses and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert it.
That's so relevant.
So relevant, yes.
Man. Last one I thought would be an easy, fun one.
Yep.
What would you do if you won the lottery?
I would pay everything off and I would move to somewhere tropical.
You're out of here.
I'm out of here.
You have it narrowed down to what tropic location? Or
Depends on how much the lottery payoff is.
you may want to have more than one house down there.
I mean, it might be like Florida or it might be Bali. Or
Yeah, it may be somewhere out of the country.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your candor on those. Let's get back to work here. We're going to pick up, and I think we left off still in Philadelphia.
And now our feature presentation.
We finished the last episode with the signing of the Constitution on September 17th, 1787 in Philadelphia. What happens next is ratification. So that's the approval process. The ratification process was set up in Article 7 of the Constitution. Article 7 is very short. The text reads as follows: the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. So that's the text of it, very short. And of course it's written the way they used to talk and write back then. But basically they're saying once 9 states have ratified, this is official. So James Madison actually developed the the plan for ratification, which would have the new Constitution presented to special ratifying conventions in each state rather than to existing state legislatures. This meant taking it directly to the voters of the states to get them to approve the Constitution, as delegates to the conventions would be elected by popular vote for the sole purpose of debating and approving the new Constitution. This plan was consistent with the preamble of the Constitution, which says, "We, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution." It also allowed the Constitution to go into effect without ratification by all 13 states, as only 9 were needed for the new Constitution to become the law of the land. So if you remember back to the Articles of Confederation, it took all 13 to approve anything. They wanted to, make this, a little more than a majority, but we don't have to have them all. So the ratification plan is an example of what's known as the social contract theory and natural rights philosophy. So we're kind of getting down in the weeds a little bit here, which came about actually during the Enlightenment in the 17th century and was encouraged by philosophers such as, and I've mentioned this man before, John Locke.
Yep.
Thomas Hobbes is another famous Enlightenment philosopher, and some others, and I'm not going to name them all. Natural rights philosophy says that all people are born with the inalienable or natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and you may recognize that term inalienable. It's used in the Declaration of Independence. It just means that they can't be taken away. So these rights, they would agree to, this would be a social contract or a move from what they referred to in their philosophy as a state of nature, which is no laws, or some might even say an anarchy state, to a civil society. So in that civil society, the people agree to form a government to protect their natural rights, and if the government fails to protect individual rights, the people are entitled to replace it by revolution if necessary. So to continue this idea, the people who were to be governed by a new government were asked to consent to its creation. This is consistent with the Declaration of Independence, which says, quote, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote. It also continued the tradition of the states, which followed similar processes during and after the Revolutionary War, when they submitted their state constitutions to their people for ratification, rather than to just the existing state legislatures. Now, ratification of this new Constitution was certainly not a foregone conclusion. Remember that in our previous episode, some delegates at the convention refused to sign the Constitution because there was no Bill of Rights. Yeah. Remember also that slavery is a huge issue, and we're going to talk about that soon in one of our, maybe our
future episodes.
Episode 13, probably. Also, many were wary of the expanded powers given to the national government and taken from the states in the new Constitution. And some still believe that in classical republicanism, and that, remember, early on we talked about that republics could only exist in a small community.
Right.
And so the United States is 13 states extending up and down the coast with large population. So many just didn't think that a republic would work. So two groups developed during the ratification process. They became known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Debates took place largely in the pages of newspapers and pamphlets. Remember, there's no TV, there's no radio, no phones, but a lot of people in 1787 read newspapers, and pamphlets were a pretty common thing to have around. A lot of people would write just on a certain issue, and they'd print those and people would pick them up. So the Anti-Federalists were against the new Constitution. Some of the Anti-Federalists had been delegates at the convention. Some of their writings were done using pseudonyms because many of the men involved were prominent members of society, business owners or government officials in their states, and they didn't want to hurt their reputations, but they wanted to put their opinions out there. Some of them, certainly not all, Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, who we've talked about before, George Mason of Virginia, also mentioned when we talked about the Constitutional Convention, and Robert Yates of New York were prominent Anti-Federalists.
Both the Virginia and the New York were already concerned from the No Bill of Rights, too, right?
Right.
So they did not sign.
Two that did not sign, yes. So their main concerns were that the new Constitution would create a government the people would not be able to control because of America's size and diversity, which were the opposite of what the idea of classical republicanism, a homogeneous small republic, and they just thought this new democratic republic would not work in such a large area. They also believed a strong national government in a large nation would be prone to abuses that had destroyed republics in ancient times. The lack of a Bill of Rights was the strongest and most powerful argument of the Anti-Federalists. Even state constitutions listed the rights the state government could not infringe on, and the Philadelphia Convention, remember, they had considered a Bill of Rights but voted it down. This became the issue the Anti-Federalists were able to use in their fight against ratification of the new Constitution. Individual rights were, after all, part of what the Declaration of Independence wanted protected and why we fought the Revolutionary War. Finally, they were also very wary of the necessary and proper and the general welfare clauses that are found in the Article 1 of the new Constitution that they felt allowed the legislative branch to have unlimited power. Federalists, as you've probably figured out, supported ratification of the new Constitution, and to try to get the ball rolling, they urged states to quickly organize and hold their ratifying conventions as fast as possible to try to keep the Anti-Federalists from gaining strength. Some of the leading Federalists were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They wrote and published a series of essays. Today they're known collectively as the Federalist Papers, which you can actually buy as a book. A few episodes ago, in the earlier part of the convention, I mentioned that Madison's writings, remember he kept the detailed notes of the convention, and also a few of the Federalist Papers were actually written while the convention was still going on. And over the years, those writings have been used a lot of times by the courts and Congress to try to determine what the true meaning of certain parts of the law they really are trying to say, because they explain it detailed in these Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers encouraged support for ratification of the new Constitution and to rebut the Anti-Federalist arguments against it. And in Federalist 10, Madison responded to one Anti-Federalist essay that argued that a Republican form of government would not work in a vast and diverse nation like the U.S. Madison argued that faction posed the greatest danger to governments of the people. By faction, Madison meant any group, majority or minority, within a society that promoted its own self-interest at the expense of the common good, which he did not define or explain. If we want to stop for just a second, first of all...
Didn't he go on to become president later?
He does. And also factions, a lot of times, they're thinking, if we think of political parties, early on in our republic, even Washington, Madison, a lot of these leaders did not want there to be political parties because they saw them as factions, which if you think about it and how I just explained what a faction is, that's kind of what a political party does. They press.
Look at today.
They're trying to push for their own interests or the interests of their little group of people. And at the expense of common good. Sometimes, if we disagree with things they're, a certain side is pushing, this is exactly what Madison was most fearful of. On the other hand, and what I used to tell students is to think that there would not be differing parties or groups that would come about is kind of unreasonable.
It's not realistic.
Because even if you just have two people, they're not going to agree on everything.
And that's what makes America great, is that we're allowed to have different opinions.
Right. So it was kind of an unreasonable thing to think that there would not be factions or political parties. But Madison did think that this would offer the biggest danger to our government. And I'm
afraid he's right.
In this day and age, I think, he had a point. So Madison continued to argue that the benefit of a large, diverse republic would be that there would be so many different factions that none would able to become a majority. He also argued that in a large nation, there would be more, and I put in quotes, fit characters, end of quote, for leadership that would better understand the common good. Also, he argued that good representatives enlarged or refined the public's views by filtering out ideas based solely on self-interest. So basically, in conclusion, Madison argued that a large, diverse republic would therefore defeat the dangers of faction. Federalists argued also that the new Constitution organized and structured the government in a way that best promoted the goals of republicanism republicanism. It did this by using checks and balances, so that's the three co-equal branches of our government, as a way to check one another. And the idea of separation of powers, the fact that they divided the power between the three branches. They argued that the processes of electing members of Congress and the president would make it more likely that good people would be elected to serve. Madison rejected the argument that the system was too complicated and it would make it difficult to get anything done. And I'm going to stop there for just a minute. That is still today, a lot of times, an argument that Congress doesn't get anything done. And I feel like in the last few years, maybe that's become worse because...
Yeah, you can just look back at Congresses and see how many bills they passed.
Right. First of all, they don't discuss. It's supposed to be a deliberative process. They either don't discuss things or they just keep going over and over the same thing. But I will add, this is not the first time that we've been in this situation. But they intended for this to be a slow process to pass bills, because the idea being if you do things too fast, sometimes they're not done very well. So they want the product that comes out of there, the laws that they pass, to be able to be carried out successfully. Back to Madison. He and other Federalists believed that the best way to prevent a bad law from being passed was to prevent a law from being passed at all. The Federalists tried various arguments to counter the Anti-Federalist complaint of no Bill of Rights at first, but eventually they see it as a way to use adding a Bill of Rights as leverage to get New York and Virginia to ratify the Constitution.
Two of the, most populated states?
The two most populated, yes, and we're going to come back to that. So by June of 1788, 9 states had voted in favor of ratification of the new Constitution, which was enough for it to take effect. So we went from September to June, so it took, about
Don't make me do math.
8 months for us to get to the magic number of 9. But again, neither New York nor Virginia were part of that 9. And these are the two largest and wealthiest states. Both with key geographical locations, both, with port cities and large cities. Without them as part of the United States, Federalists were fearful that the U.S. would not survive. To get enough support from those two states for ratification, Federalists agree that when the first Congress meets, they would support adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. So Virginia finally ratifies on June 26, 1788. New York debates it for another month, and finally they ratify on July 26, 1788. Now, we still have 2 states left out there that haven't ratified yet, North Carolina and Rhode Island.
Rhode Island didn't even come. Were they the ones that didn't even come to the convention?
They did not, because they were satisfied with the Articles of Confederation. Okay. So, yes, North Carolina and Rhode Island did not ratify until after the new Congress proposed the 10 amendments that become the Bill of Rights. And that was not until November 1789 for North Carolina and May 1790 for Rhode Island. Wow. So they held out a long time. Let's take a look at one of the clauses that I mentioned that the Anti-Federalists were really concerned about, and it is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution, so it falls under the legislative branch. Why is it controversial? And I say in present tense because sometimes it still is controversial, but the clause also, this might give you a clue, is known as the Elastic Clause. It states that, and this is the actual wording, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. End of quote from the Constitution. Now, Clause 18, it's the last clause. The first 17 parts of Section 8 are the actual enumerated powers of Congress. So they actually are the detailed ones, the ones that spell out in detail what Congress's powers are. This was left for last as kind of none of those other 17 parts cover something. You might be able to use this one to do that. You got 18. This clause grants what are known as implied powers to Congress in addition to those 17 enumerated, the listed and specific powers. Implied means that it's not explicitly stated. In simple terms, the Necessary and Proper Clause gives Congress the authority to create laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out its other powers. Think of it as an extra set of tools that Congress can use in addition to its explicitly listed powers. So this clause gives government some flexibility to adapt to new situations and challenges without needing to amend the Constitution every time something new comes about.
Which is why, and we've talked about this, Bobbi, that I think we both agree that we view our government set up, and especially the Constitution, as living, breathing, evolving.
Right. And I think I mentioned that in the next episode.
Perfect.
Just to give you an idea of how the necessary and proper clause has been used, and this is not a complete list, but here are some important things that Congress has been able to do since 1789 by using that clause. In the early 1800s, they established a national bank. And there actually is a landmark Supreme Court case called McCulloch versus Maryland, which was in 1819, where the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of a national bank, arguing that it was necessary and proper means of carrying out Congress's powers to tax, borrow money, and regulate commerce. You know, how do you do those things without a bank to depend upon? Another one is regulating interstate commerce. So this clause has been used to justify numerous federal regulations of interstate commerce, meaning between our states, including laws related to transportation, communications, and consumer protection. Another one is establishing a federal judicial system. I mentioned a couple episodes ago, Article 3 of the Constitution is not very specific, and that the Congress, soon after it first started meeting, had to define the courts more, and in the Judicial Act of 1789, they create more specific plan for a Supreme Court and other federal courts and the scope of their powers. Enforcing civil rights. The clause was used to provide the legal basis for legislation aimed at enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which are known as the Civil War Amendments, which abolished, the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th guaranteed voting rights, especially to Black Americans. And so those are, I think we would agree, are important. Before World War II and during, various New Deal programs that President Roosevelt brought about to bring us out of the Depression. Many of those programs were aimed at stabilizing the economy and providing Social Security. They were justified under the necessary and proper clause in combination with other powers that are specified, like the Commerce Clause. And then finally, one that's more recent, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, Congress invoked the necessary and proper clause in combination with other powers to pass legislation that provided relief and stimulus programs.
I remember those well.
You know, once again, without that clause, the only way to have dealt with some of these issues would have been to try to pass another amendment to the Constitution or create a law, you know, that to add, which basically would be an amendment. So we still have some loose ends to tie up, such as the General Welfare Clause, which I mentioned earlier. Also, the writ of habeas corpus.
Yes.
And what the preamble actually means. The Electoral College, which is not an institution of higher learning. That's not what college means here.
Different college.
Right. Then the slavery issue in the Constitution, a Bill of Rights, and we're going to be covering those issues over the next couple of episodes, so stay tuned.
Ooh, I'm just going to let out a little. So many of the things. It was a good one, though. When I look at this, I also watch what's happening in the news today. We're going to talk about this more next episode as well, but these things may be over 200 years old, but we see the different things that come up with why these things are in place. And again, it's amazing to me that our founding fathers kind of planned for all these break the glass emergencies. So thank you for that. Now it's time for the pop quiz. Bueller.
So last episode's question was name one branch or part of the U.S. government, and I actually gave you clues during that episode.
Throughout the episode.
So if you answered one would be the legislative branch, or it's also known as Congress, so either answer would have been correct. 2, the executive branch or president, which would be the president and his cabinet. And then 3, the judicial branch or the federal court system, which is the Supreme Court and other federal courts around the United States.
And those were all set up in Articles 1, 2, and 3, right?
Exactly.
And Article 1 was the longest, wasn't it?
It is.
Yeah, so there you go. Those are all fun facts. So do you have another question for us?
Yes. So this time, we're going to go back a little ways. What are 2 rights mentioned in the Declaration of Independence?
Ooh, okay. And there are how many possible answers?
There are 3. And if you think about probably some of the most important words of the Declaration, you should be able to come up with them.
Okay. So fair enough. Look on our Facebook page for these answers as well. And we always post some little extra links. And I think the kitty cats made your kitty cats made the Facebook,
They did.
the Facebook page, so you can see Bobby's 3 kitties there as well. And soon you'll see some of the pets around my house. So thank you for all the homework, Bobbi.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.